At the altar, the room held its breath, as if the chandeliers themselves were listening. Crystal pendants jittered with the murmurs, cameras blinked in unison, and somewhere in the back, a waiter froze mid-pour, a ribbon of champagne caught between bottle and flute. Everything was choreography, lights, vows, reputation. Then Michael Jones turned. He had always turned other people's worlds with the same casual decisiveness he used to cut through a boardroom meeting. One step, one shrug, and a history was rearranged. Tonight, his suit was sharp enough to be a headline. His smile had been trained to reassure shareholders and seduce allies. He stepped off the dais as if rehearsed, as if the scene had been written in some ledger he refused to share with the rest of them. "Lina," he said, and the name landed like an accusation. It was not the name the bride expected. It was not the name anyone expected. Lina, the woman in the navy dress who had been introduced earlier as a friend, had been all but invisible that evening. Delivery gloves tucked into her handbag. A small patch of flour dust at the cuff from a kitchen she claimed to have worked in that morning. A courier's gait she had kept for years, a stance that read as practical, not polished. Cameras whooped, a few drunk guests laughed and nudged. Then their laughter died. Michael's hand found Lina's in a movement that stripped the room of noise. He raised her hand as though pledging something entirely different, and the orchestra that had been coaxed into a swelling waltz stalled on a dissonant chord. At the head table, the bride's face crumpled in a slow, televised ruin. She had believed the narrative that had been sold to the room, an alliance, a union of convenience and influence. Tonight, millions of dollars of optics and months of careful arrangement were supposed to culminate in a contract sealed with a kiss. Instead, they watched the groom choose another woman like he was selecting a new emblem, a symbol pulled from the crowd. Gasps rustled through the guests, phones rose like a flock, screens documenting the betrayal with a ferocity that would not end. Reporters who had been planted for the inevitable toasts found their leads dissolved into chaos. Socialites whispered into their cuffs. Security stiffened, unsure whether to act or to hold the theater for the moment's entertainment value. Lina's fingers were trembling. Michael smiled at her as if he had not just detonated an entire room's carefully stacked illusions. "I can't," he said, voice smooth as silk but edged with a hunger that would have been obscene if it weren't performed in front of so many witnesses. "You're—" the bride began, and the word hung, uncompletable. Married became an impossible verb to finish under the weight of what Michael had just thrown across the aisle. Outside, a dozen news vans idled like sleeping sharks. A hashtag began forming mid-sentence. The wedding's curated narrative unraveled into an instant trial by public opinion. If humiliation had a sound, it would have been the clatter of a wedding cake being cut into the wrong silence, the awkward applause for a toast that never finished, the discreet slurp of champagne someone forced down to steady a shaking hand. Lina stood between a ring and a reporter's microphone, and everyone seemed to want something different from her. A confession, a scandal, a scapegoat. She had not come for the spectacle. She had come because Michael had once been a man who took lunch with her on a rainy backstreet after she'd handed him a package that was supposed to contain nothing more than paperwork. He'd been kinder in the dimness, and kindness had footprints that lingered. She had not expected gratitude in return that would rearrange the world for her. She had not expected to be invited onto a dais as if she were a prize. But opportunities, like trains, sometimes arrive at platforms where you had not been expecting to get off. She kept her gaze level as the cameras carved her face into frames. Under the light, the small pendant she had been wearing all night winked, an odd old thing, a flattened oval of hammered metal threaded into a thin chain. Guests glanced at it as if it might explain the theft of that evening. Michael's fingers brushed it when he raised her hand, and for a second a prescription of shock seemed to pass between them, an understanding, perhaps, of leverage or coincidence. Someone in the back began to chant the bride's name like a litany. Voices multiplied into factions: the betrayed, the delighted, the vulture-minded. A man near the buffet spat out a remark about staged affairs. A woman at the bride's side wept with a theater of her own, dramatic and unafraid. Cameras pivoted. Someone from the press pushed forward with a microphone. "Mr. Jones, what is this? Are you leaving her at the altar for your—" "For Lina," Michael said, softer now, as if to a child. And then he said something that had been rehearsed not for love, but for spectacle. "Because I've found someone who chose me, even when the world told her not to." The words struck a chord that wasn't quite melody. That claim, someone who chose him, rearranged the room yet again. The bride, standing in satin, looked less like a woman wronged than like a symbol discarded. Her eyes were wet with indignation that would feed 1,000 editorials. "Stay with us to see how the truth unfolds," someone said, voice low but present, a producer's whisper that seemed to promise that this would be more than a story. The camera lingered longer on Lina's necklace, as if the pendant could be interrogated for the answers it did not yet give. The first block closed on the image of Lina's hand raised awkwardly on the altar, the pendant catching the chandelier light like a small, inexplicable prophecy. They tried to make her into something simpler right away. By the time the aftershocks of the interruption had settled into a dozen new narratives, 3 men in tailored coats had arrived as if summoned by the event's gravitational pull. Sheeran and Sheeran, twin names spoken in the same breath in corporate filings and gossip columns, and a third, older man with hair like iron wire, whose presence was a punctuation point, Cade Merrow. They moved through the crowd with quiet assurance. Suits in public are armed with signatures, and signatures are holdings. Their appearance in the gilded room reframed the evening as more than a lover's quarrel. It became a ledger dispute. Sheeran's smile was thin, measured. "Michael," he said, and the greeting was an assessment, the tone that a banker uses to probe an investment's appetite. Sheeran's eyes were a pale, unblinking appraisal. Cade's glance skimmed the crowd like a tax inspector checking receipts. They stopped within a few meters of Lina. For all the cameras, for all the screaming hashtags, the 3 men were focused on one singular object, the pendant at Lina's throat. It was, absurdly, as if the tiny oval of metal bore the same weight as a deed. The gossip spread like wildfire. A family emblem, a lost crest, an heirloom. "It matches the description," Cade murmured, leaning toward Sheeran's ear. Just a whisper, and yet recorded in the air for anyone who wanted the drama. "Supposedly." "We'll verify," Sheeran said. The word verify felt like a verdict in itself. He had the calm of someone accustomed to calling in lab results and quiet documents that folded empires into a line item. A discreet card snapped between his fingers. An invitation to a private lab, a forensic service known to corroborate lineage claims for the ultra-rich. Someone had thought to bring forensics to a wedding. That was the difference between rumor and asset. Proof. It is easy to reduce Lina in the minds of others. Courier, outsider, mistress. Even some of the press used the language of vulgar theater. She had been found in the crowd, as if she were misplaced scenery. People preferred tidy stories. Those with power write the early drafts. For Lina, those early drafts were treacherous. The first test was ceremonial. Cade moved with a showman's patience and produced a small velvet box, the sort you give to reveal something definitive. Inside, a ribbon of worn parchment and 2 photographs. The photographs were yellowed, edges soft. One of a woman in an older style of dress, the other of the same woman with a younger man at her side, arms folded in a pose that suggested lineage. Eyes at the tables leaned forward. People love inheritance stories the way they love accidents. "Where did you get that?" Michael snapped, a crack in a facade that had been smooth all night. Lina's throat was tight. I don't know," she said.
It was the truth. She had not been given that pendant as a ticket to tonight's disaster. It had been a token from an old woman in a corner bakery 3 weeks earlier. A woman who had insisted Lina take it with no explanation but a line about keeping it until the right hour. Lina had laughed then, thinking it was superstition, a relic someone wanted to pass along. She had never imagined anyone would read meaning into a trinket carried between deliveries. "It proves nothing," the bride, now publicly the one abandoned, cried. Her voice was raw, edged with a kind of righteous flood, and yet she was already a performance, a wronged woman playing the role to its fullest length. The three men waved for calmness, the way one might wave off a spill. "We ask questions for the sake of order," Chiron said with a tone that implied he would be asking those questions until answers surrendered. "There's precedent. If there's a rightful claim, it must be examined." They proposed a quick test. The pendant to be taken to a private facility for analysis, a rapid DNA test on a hair from Lina's hairbrush, which, of course, would have to be located, and an inspection of any documents she might carry. Michael agreed with an eagerness that made the room hum with collective hunger. For him, truth was malleable. When the ledger leaves an opening, you close it with whatever instrument secures your advantage. Which is to say, power has a tendency to stack its deck. At the back, the security captain, broad, with the face of someone who has been asked to enforce impossible things, made note of the mechanics. "No trouble," he said into his earpiece, and the reassurance fell flat as a promise. Lina's phone buzzed. A text, one word, a ghost of a lifeline. Hold. No contact name, no sender. She kept the phone hidden beneath her folded program, like a contraband pet. The universe had been disordered tonight, and in the scrubbed corners of her past, there were allies who counted. She did not know if they would answer. They took the pendant and carried it away in a glass case like a small crown. In the meantime, Chiron decided that a triage of proofs would help keep the room honest. A public declaration, a brief interrogation, and then the test in private. The press loved intervals. They loved to be fed scraps and sizzle. In the space between, rumors fermented. An actor can flip an audience by timing alone. The architects of this evening staged dramatic pauses that felt like punctuation. Whispered phone calls, the subtle rearranging of chairs, a cameraman who, accidentally, angled for a close-up of a trembling hand. Lina found herself surrounded by small, mean things. Someone called her a plant. Another suggested she was an actress with a sob story in her back pocket. A woman at a neighboring table reached over and plucked at the hem of Lina's dress as if to check its authenticity. Laughter rolled around like loose change. The captain of security suggested that for the comfort of the guest of honor, meaning the bride, they escort Lina to a side room to clarify facts. It was phraseology designed to be humane. Lina could see the trap in it. She could see the path of being made into a parable. If she went quietly, her dignity would be parceled out to tabloids. If she resisted, people would tape her resistance and turn it into evidence of instability. She did not go quietly. "You're taking me where?" she asked, and the question surprised even her with its steadiness. Her voice had the flatness of someone who had practiced managing expectations. "Just to ask a few more questions," the captain said, his voice low and professional, "for everyone's comfort."
For everyone's comfort, Lina echoed, tasting the words. She looked at Michael and found his eyes already cooled. He had chosen spectacle over alliance and now wrapped his choice with the arms of pragmatism. Her phone buzzed again, this time a photo, a blurred image of an older woman in a bakery, hand extended with a pendant, and beneath it a caption, "Do not let them take what's yours." No sender again. The message felt like a lifeline, and yet it was fragile as a cigarette in rain. The side room peaked like a trapdoor. Inside, the lighting was utilitarian. A desk stood against the wall with a single recorder and a tray of water. A man from the press leaned in as if interested in moral pedagogy. The captain closed the door politely. They wanted a controlled confession, an admission that everything had been a stunt. They wanted her to dissolve into a redemption arc they could shape into a piece of content that would die in an afternoon. Instead, Lina reached into her bag and took out a small, battered leather notebook. People expected she had nothing but a misplaced pendant. The notebook was an old habit. Addresses, delivery notes, names of places that had not existed in a glossy city guide. It contained, beneath the scribble and the receipts, a tidy notation. Kestrel Trust, account dormant. Last will, Evelyn Kestrel. Executor, Vivian Marquez. See sealed docs, Swiss deposit. The captain's hand, which hovered over the recorder, seized. "Let me see that," he said. "That's nothing," the man with the tied scarf said quickly. The color drained from his cheeks as if a scandal had been scribbled under his own name. Numbers have an ability to rewrite the narrative. A line in a ledger can topple a career more efficiently than an attack on honor. "Who is Evelyn Kestrel?" Kay asked, almost conversationally. That question was a pickaxe. Kestrel was a name with weight in the city's old registry. Philanthropies, a reputation of old money that liked to pose as morality. Kestrel's trusts had been the backbone of many charities and also the shelter of 100 discreet inheritances. "I'm not," Lina began, but the captain's hand did not extend. Instead, he slid over a manila envelope to her with a neutral flick.
"If you have documents, hand them over." She didn't hand anything over. The notebook had written proof, but proof must be submitted in proper form to be honored. Instead, she tapped another little device hidden beneath the notebook, a hardened USB disguised as a key. It was a last resort she had never believed she'd need. She connected it to the captain's workstation while everyone watched, fingers steady. The file that sprung up was a single PDF, time-stamped, sealed with a notary stamp that smelled faintly of bureaucracy and the coffee of many midnight offices. It bore a name, Kestrel Holding AG. Beneath it, a line of corporate titles and signatures that were not hers to have, on their face, unless someone somewhere had made a very deliberate mistake. "This is fraud," Sheeran said immediately, his voice a winter wind. "We will validate. This could be a forgery." "It could be," Lina allowed. Her voice kept its measured tone because it had to. She didn't have the room to unravel further. "But it's real." "You expect us to accept that?" Cade's laugh was a short thing, the kind you hear before a game of poker whose stakes include reputations and stock options. "Not accept," Lina said. "Verify." She had that much cunning, to put the burden of proof on them, to force the powerful to use their own machinery to disprove her. It was safer to have your enemy accuse you than to have him pile on silent evidence. At least accusations can be answered. Conspiracies quiet can smother you. They called in an auditor, an impartial third party that Michael's people had no immediate control over, which was, in itself, a small misstep on their part. The auditor asked for time, and the room negotiated breathing space like an obsequious hostage negotiation.
For the guests, this stretched the soap opera out another hour. For the principals, it was a postponement of the collapse that none of them wanted to walk back from. The bride made a show of retreating with her closest friends. Her sobs were vivid enough to populate endless morning shows. Cameras dipped toward Michael for a reaction, and he gave them a smile that had been designed for incineration of doubt. Calm, unbothered, predatory. He believed himself unassailable. But every ledger has weak ink. Sheeran had overreached in a minor way by bringing in a lab known for speed rather than for infallibility. The forged results they used to humiliate Lina had been prepared by a man with a scarf and a team that liked to close narratives. In stacking their deck, they had created a network of lies, and lies, when pulled tight together, often snap. In the next hour, the scene devolved into smaller, meaner things. Their lawyers whispered like termites in the corners. A man who had been introduced as John, legal counsel and quick decision-maker, leaned in and offered Lina a thin mercy. Sign a non-disclosure, accept a settlement, vanish. It was elegant in its malice. Remove the variable quietly, buy silence.
Lina listened without flinching. She had seen offers like this before in $2 casseroles served for $3 favors. It was an economy dependent on people's appetite for security. But she refused, not because she loved spectacle, but because she had obligations that could not be purchased with hush money. She had kept a ledger of her own. The Kestrel documents were not just about her. They were about promises made to people who had thought themselves invisible. "You can buy silence," she said quietly, "but you cannot buy history." That line landed like a pebble thrown into a glass bowl. It cracked the illusion everyone preferred. It also made the room more nervous. Histories are unruly and sometimes explosive. Histories can be accompanied by accounts and signatures, and the signature of a man who had made a foolish, arrogant promise in a hidden room years ago. Someone in Michael's circle moved to intercept the device that held the Kestrel file. Hands reached across the desk, polite at first, then brusque. The captain tried to restore order with his handshake iron. A scuffle, no more than a press of bodies and a clipped shout, ensued, and cameras caught every millisecond. That press gave the room a new clip to loop for days. Mistress struggles, security intervenes. In the press of bodies, Lina felt something dislodge in her chest, a small, contained fury that had the shape of a plan. She had been taught to walk away. As a child, she had been trained to make herself small and invisible to survive. As an adult, she had refined that form into a strength like a muscle you can choose to flex or not. Tonight, however, she would choose to flex. Her survival had never been thy only goal. There was also a ledger to settle, a promise she had been given by a woman with flour on her apron. Lina let her eyes scan the room and landed on a face that had been quiet all evening. Reed. He had been introduced earlier as an executive liaison, below Sharon on the corporate ladder, but with reach into different balances. His hands were in his pockets, the phone concealed. He had been nodding too quickly earlier. Now his gaze found hers and held it like an offer. His mouth moved. He mouthed words that could not be caught by the microphones. 2 syllables. Later. Trust. In the chaos, the pendant lay safe in a glass case on the head table, its metal catching the light like one more small accusation. The lab reports had not yet exonerated or condemned. The story was spinning, but not yet decided. They escorted Lina from the room politely enough that it looked like protocol, and later ransacked the side pockets of her life for charges. They found small things. A receipt from a Swiss bank branch that she had never visited, but whose numbers matched those in the PDF.
A note with names of charities and dates. A photograph tucked between pages in an old notebook. One of Evelyn Kestrel smiling with an arm around a woman who might have been Lina's grandmother.
Each discovery was a comma, each denial a dust motes. As she was lifted into a car they sent for her, the city outside the windows seemed to hold its breath, long and close. The news feeds had run a single clip over and over. Michael's smile, the pendant, the bride's face. In those hours, the city formed opinions, as cities do, like crowds building a wall of judgment. Inside the car, Lina reached for her phone. Her fingers hovered over a contact saved under V. There were protocols to be observed and allies to be assembled. She could not reveal everything. No one trusts a revelation that comes with all its cards in open view, but she could nudge a plan into motion. Her thumb tapped the contact. The call did not go through. Instead, a message blinked on screen. Delay activated. Wait for. It was a schedule, a prearranged trigger that would set in motion an audit prepared long ago. Transfers to be unlocked if certain criteria were met. Signatures to be revealed. A corporate entity that had been kept dormant until its true heir needed it. Lina allowed herself a private, tiny smile. The woman from the bakery had known something the rest of them did not. The car slid away from the hotel like a boat slipping from a dock, while the tide pulled the spectacle behind it. On the head table, the pendant still glimmered, held now in the temporary custody of men who would treat it as evidence rather than heirloom. The room's murmurs shifted from immediate spectacle to conspiracy. The wedding had become an alleged theft of identity, and identity, in their world, had a number attached to it. They could try to use the law as a club. They could try to buy reputations, purge witnesses, and manufacture consent. But there were moments when money and power became arrogant enough to commit small mistakes, to assume that a pendant was worthless, that a courier was merely a courier, that a woman's life had no claim on a trust hatched in a different century. From those small mistakes, larger things can bloom. Lawsuits, audits, frozen assets, subpoenas served cold. Outside, a van with tinted windows idled with engines ready. In the premiere of small decisions, there was always someone who would decide to sign a paper, and someone else who would decide not to. Lina's decision had been unexpectedly simple. She would not allow them to write her story alone. Inside the hotel's private garage, as flashbulbs still pinged somewhere behind their walls, Lina was led into a small room to answer more questions. Her hands had been padded for contraband, and in those hands she had hidden a single small device that made it possible for a long dormant holding to stir if the right combination of triggers fired. A notarized affidavit, an escrow activation, and a single email address that had been approved years ago by a dying woman with the last integrity of old money. She was asked to sign a non-disclosure, as if the burden were only hers. She read the document with a calm that made the men around her impatient. The clause forbidding public dissemination of purported familial claims was thinly veiled. They wanted to make the scandal their property. Lina did not sign. Instead, she slid an envelope across the desk to the legal counsel. Inside, in plain sight, was a copy of the Swiss notary's statement with a line of signatures that included a now familiar handwriting. Evelyn Kestrel. Witness M. Hargreaves. Hargreaves was not a name they expected to find linked to Evelyn, at least not publicly. It raised more questions than it answered. The legal counsel's hand twitched as if to snatch the paper away. And at that twitch, Lina saw the faintest opening. Law is a river that rushes where the dam gives way. She did not need to flow. She needed to corner the dam and see what pressure it released.
"You realize signing this will do nothing to erase what evidence exists," she said quietly. "You can sue me for months, but you cannot unpublish a ledger." "It's not published," the counsel said automatically, a man who had been taught to believe in the supremacy of contracts. He was wrong, but his wrongness was the kind that makes men dangerous. "If it's true, we'll follow law. If it's fraud, you'll be prosecuted." "Then follow it," Lina said. "If it's fraud, bring the fraudsters forward." Silence. This, for a moment, was the true battleground. Menace and refusal in a room whose ceiling lights had been designed to make people honest. Outside, a camera caught Michael in the hallways with a phone glued to his ear. His expression had the kind of flat anger people reserve for canceled performances. He could still win if he had the money and the arrogance to buy the narrative. He had not counted on stubbornness, on the kind of economic patience Lina had been permitted by destiny, in the form of a document few believed she was entitled to hold. As the door to the room opened and Lina was ushered back to the street, a pedestrian again, eyes a little too raw for the city, she felt the hum of a world that had not yet decided whether to kill her softly with rumor or to cut her out completely. She had a few hours, maybe a day, to adjust the pieces. Lives are not turned in a moment, but a moment can set a chain of small decisions going that ends with a different ledger. And in a small Swiss bank vault, in a registered company that had not been touched in years, there sat a letter with the seal of Evelyn Kestrel, and a postscript in a handwriting Lina recognized from an old photograph. "To the one who finds the heart, when they come dressed in glitter and lies, you will know what to do." The instructions had been practical. Appoint legal counsel, prepare a forensic audit, contact the escrow. They had been written for someone who would be taught to believe themselves small, but had to claim a legacy at the right time. Tonight, that time had come.
As Lina's car pulled away into the indifferent night, a satellite of whispers followed. She stared at the pendant's reflection in the window, no longer an ornament, but an argument. Somewhere deep in the city, men in suits made calls and canceled flights and drafted memos meant to reconstruct control. In another part of town, an older woman in a bakery smiled at the television without the smallest tremor. She had known the hour and had set a small, improbable thing in motion. The story was not finished. It was only beginning to thicken, like ink finding itself in water. There would be falsified tests, actors who would deny things they had been paid to remember, and a series of legal maneuvers designed to keep Lina on the back foot. There would be moments when the system would bite like a net, threatening to entangle her in questions of identity and legitimacy. But there would also be signatures, documents, and corporate forms that could not be smudged by gossip. At the corner of a boulevard, a car stopped and a man slid into the back seat. His face was unreadable. He introduced himself as Reed and offered a single line that read like an armistice. "We don't believe in miracles. We believe in numbers. You have both, if you let us help." Lina looked at him. The city spread around them like a map of choices. She could accept help and begin to fight with legal artillery and audits, or she could keep moving in the shadows. It was not about vengeance, it was about retribution by ledger, taking away the weapons of those who had thought themselves untouchable because they could pay a narrative into existence. She thought of Evelyn's handwriting in the dimness and of the woman who had passed the pendant in a flour-dusted bakery. She thought of promises and of people who had no voice and the way wealth sometimes spoke for them without asking permission. A small smile tugged at the edge of her mouth. "Then help," she said. Reed's hands folded together. "Good. We start with freezing the assets. We force an independent audit. We issue subpoenas." "Subpoenas," Lina repeated. The word was a small grenade in her mouth, tidy, legal, suffocating in its civil efficacy. She liked the sound of it. "It will take time," Reed warned, "and they will try to make you look desperate."
I am, Lina said, but I am not alone. They drove into a city that was still talking about a wedding that had failed to be merely a wedding. The night announced nothing. Its darkness was impartial. Yet in the inboxes of the powerful, plans were being redrawn. The three men who had first announced themselves as arbiters of truth found themselves consulting their own counsel in hurried, anxious tones. Michael, who preferred to command, scoured options with the same furious, efficient cruelty he applied to other parts of his life. Back at the hotel, a handful of guests lingered like ash.
The bride, a portrait of sudden sorrow and betrayed performance, was attended by lawyers who whispered remedies and backup plans, lawsuits, PR damage control, financial settlements. Power, as always, shifted hands through instruments, through signatures, and not through spectacle alone. Lina's allies would need time and a law firm's patience. They would need to thread past falsified tests and planted witnesses. They would need to pry open the most guarded of vaults. And if public narrative could be calibrated, they'd need to hold the truth long enough for audits to speak louder than fiction. When the car rounded a corner and the lights softened into the city's indifferent glow, Lina allowed herself the smallest exhale. She was aware, sharply, of the fact that she had been exposed in the most humiliating way possible. She had been dragged through gossip, filmed, mocked. Yet the pendant at her throat was now both shield and compass. The evening had shown the worst of the people who thought themselves powerful, and in their arrogance they had revealed a seam. Power, she had learned in different rhythms of life, is woven into small human errors. A lab that values speed over truth. A man who believes money buys narratives. A friend who will turn. A signature that can be copied. She planned to exploit those errors with the kind of patience that cost less than vengeance and could achieve far more. In a high-rise somewhere, a man named Sheeran sat at his desk and tapped his pen impatiently. He would not be outmaneuvered. He had not become wealthy by leaving openings. He called in favors with a voice honed by the rustle of contracts. His problem was a woman with a pendant and a strange file, and his tools were not accustomed to working with ambiguity. But ambiguity is useful. It allows for maneuvers and the spinning of stories. It allows. Sheeran tapped his pen until the wood gave a thin, irritated sound and called a number that had lived for years in the Rolodexes of men who solved problems by reallocating them. He did not like being hurried. He liked contingency. Night had thinned into tabs of messages, and the meeting at the hotel had become an ugly splash of publicity that could not be scrubbed away with a check. He wanted containment, fast, clean, and convincing. Across the city, Cade Merrow convened his own inner circle in an office that smelt faintly of citrus and old leather. A place where reputations were rebranded and inconvenient truths were dressed up as misunderstandings. Cade's instinct was to neutralize, contain the pendant as an anomaly, and erase the ledger before auditors could smell ink. Make it a fraud narrative, he said, as if that were a tidy thing one could order from the back menu. They'll take comfort in a villain. People don't want complexity. Michael, who had a private roster of angry habits, did what he always did when his public life threatened to become messy. He leaned on muscle.
Not the kind that crushed, but the kind that smoothed. He called in favors, texted threats into the polite language of men who had never learned to be subtle, and scheduled 2 emergency meetings, one for damage control with his PR, another in the morning with the board. He had, in his mind, created the spectacle and could dissolve it. He misjudged the persistence of paper and the stubbornness of signatures. Lina, meanwhile, moved with the economy of someone who had learned to carry everything she needed and nothing she didn't. She slept for an hour in a borrowed flat while messages came in like small, insistent storms. Hold. Wait for.
And then a line that made her stomach stiffen with a kind of cold joy. Escrow active. Swiss bank confirms conditional access. Notary validated. Reed's terse updates read like orders and like promises. He had given her the kind of help you do not request in small moments. Strategic lethality with numbers. Auditors who spoke in footnotes. They began by freezing the obvious. An injunction, temporary, precise, slid into a judge's inbox before dawn. It named Michael Jones and 3 corporate entities whose letterheads had adorned the wedding table as defendants in a suit to determine rightful ownership of Kestrel Holding AG and the assets it controlled. The judge, who had seen many ceremonial suits thin into bitter ones, granted a temporary freeze on transfers pending an independent audit. When lawyers speak of freezes, what they mean is this: sudden impotence for the spendthrift, a clockwork halt on the music of power. The freeze forced Sharon and Michael into administrative motions that smelled faintly of panic. Contracts could not be signed. Board meetings could be delayed. Payroll might not be authorized. To men who measured themselves in transactions, the inability to move money was cruelty. Michael's people escalated their PR. Leaks suggesting Lina was part of an elaborate revenge plot. Anonymous sources who remembered seeing actors rehearse in the hotel lobby. A glossy op-ed suggesting the entire thing was a stunt to launch a new brand. But Reed had expected this. Spin, he told Lina when they met in a room that smelled like coffee and legal pads, is part of the theater. We don't fight with melodrama. We fight with proof. He had assembled a team the way others assemble armies. A forensic accountant who smiled like an abacus, a Swiss attorney with patience as a weapon, and a digital investigator who could find the timestamp in a PDF that no one thought to look into. The independent audit arrived under the cold stars of corporate governance. A white paper procedure, 2 highly respected auditors whose neutrality was their currency, and a mandate to follow the money, the metadata, and the chain of custody. Audits do not move quickly. They move insistently. That insistence became Lina's friend. At first, the road looked dirty. The scarfed consultant who had produced the convenient lab results in the hotel had been thorough in a way that suggested planning. His report had neat stamps and a footnote. The initial lab, the one flown in with Chiron's influence, confirmed tampering with a sample and the presence of an alloy inconsistent with standard family heirloom metals, the report claimed. The ceremonial DNA swab had been reported as contaminated. The lab's chain of custody showed a break. Those breaks are easy to declare and harder to prove. Reed's team, however, read those breaks like a map. They subpoenaed CCTV footage from the hotel's service corridors and from the private lab's courier drop-off. They requested the chain of custody logs for every sample related to the pendant and the hair swab. They served discovery on the lab and the PR firms. Men who had thought themselves invisible in the net of paperwork woke up to envelopes. A grainy corridor camera showed the scarfed man, an itinerant consultant they later learned worked for a boutique forensic firm commonly hired by wealthy clients, stepping into a service elevator with a courier box. He arrived at the lab, and, within the window of time the sample should have been processed, he left with a smaller envelope. On the footage, he did not appear to remove anything. What he did, however, was hold a pad and ostensibly sign for a chain of custody document. That signature was, Reed's investigator found, an identical match to others he had signed for different clients. They traced the scarfed man's payment method to a shell account associated with a consulting firm that had been doing favors for Michael's circle. It was the unglamorous things that unraveled powerful men. Copies of receipt stubs, a banker's note that showed a night transfer to a lab manager with a memo so elliptical it could be interpreted as a bribe.
They found emails in which a PR consultant requested expedited results and an attached composition list that matched the metal in the scarfed man's envelope. Those emails had been sent from a burner account registered to a domain that, when traced, led back to an IP in a building owned by a company in which Michael held a minority stake. The line connecting Scarfed Man to Michael was not one they could hang like a noose, but it was enough to call into question the provenance of the lab's fast results. Parallel to the digital forensics, the Swiss affidavit began to awaken. The Kestrel Trust was not only a name in an old ledger, it was a legal instrument with signatures, witnesses, and, crucially, an activation clause that required proof of heirship combined with a notarized affirmation. Evelyn Kestrel had been precise in her paperwork. She had also prepared contingencies. Her letter, found in the vault and delivered by the bakery woman years earlier, had been a roadmap. And now, Lina had unlocked one of the map's gates.
The Swiss bank, slow, stubborn, and suspicious of noise, requested corroborating documentation. They asked for authenticated photographs, notarized signatures, and proof that the alleged heir had legal representation. Reed provided everything, including the digital copy of the Kestrel notary attached to Lina's USB. The bank's compliance team, used to the comings and goings of false heirs and glossy scammers, nonetheless had to honor the paperwork. Legal structures have their own gravity. The first public crack of confidence for Michael came in a sealed hearing where an independent audit firm presented a preliminary report. It was terse and careful. The pendant's metallurgy was not determinative. The alleged chain of custody for the hotel DNA had inconsistencies impossible to ignore. The scarfed consultant's lab had, the report noted, a pattern of rapid results and occasional irregularities. The auditors declined to name a conclusion. They could not. Their job was to raise questions, to produce sufficient material for a court to decide. But questions can topple reputations as readily as answers. One television program took the auditor's cautious language and played it as a headline. "Chain of custody questioned" ran across the screen in bold letters as pundits convened to discuss how the wealthy protect their own. Social feeds churned with clips from the wedding. Michael's face, set like stone in protest, began to look brittle under the right light. Michael's initial plan had been to make Lina small enough that news cycles could ignore the matter. When that failed, he tried to bury the matter with settlements and quiet agreements. He offered the bride hush money packaged as compensation for reputational harm. He met with Sharon and Cade. They argued about speed. Sharon wanted aggressive litigation to discredit the Kestrel documents. Cade wanted a sanitized mediation that would keep the press at bay. Michael wanted victory, and when men want victory enough, they often confuse it with control. That control began to slip. Institutional investors, fund managers who paid attention to stability more than to gossip, started to make noise. A large pension fund that held a block of shares in Michael's flagship company called for an emergency review of Michael's appointment. The board, already uneasy with the PR fallout and the prospect of frozen assets, convened an emergency session. Michael addressed the board with the kind of eloquent cruelty he used in negotiations. Charm, a thinly veiled threat, a plan to manage the narrative. But nerves in the boardroom are contagious. The board's counsel, a man whose livelihood depended on prudent language, recommended that Michael be placed on temporary leave until the audit concluded. The temporary leave became a public spectacle when a major shareholder, an investment firm known for decisive stances, tabled a motion demanding Michael's removal as CEO pending the conclusion of the investigation into potential misappropriation of company funds. The board could not block such a motion without appearing complicit. Votes were cast, proxies called, and in a result that stunned both tabloids and power players alike, the motion carried. Michael was suspended from his day-to-day duties. His title remained, but his hand on the keys of the corporate engine was loosened. Humiliation in the equation of power is often both public and spiritual. For Michael, removed from control and watched by the cameras who had once adored his swagger, shame registered like an ache. He had been used to the aesthetic of command, speeches, faces turned toward him, a table arranged like a throne. Now, the table looked back at him with agendas and legal remedies. He was not physically broken, there was no blood on the floor, but his reputation, the fungible currency he had traded skillfully, was being devalued. Lina's fight, however, was only beginning. Freezes, suspensions, and headlines are fragile things. The opposition tried to move quickly, manufacturing narratives, forged emails that appeared to show Lina coordinating with unnamed activists, a podcast that replayed clipped sentences arranged to look incriminating. Michael's allies produced witnesses who testified to seeing actors placed in the hotel lobby rehearsing an ambush, although their accounts were inconsistent and sometimes contradicted by timestamps. The defense's strategy was simple: create doubt, and with enough doubt, the court of public opinion neutralizes inconvenient facts. Reed's team countered with precision. They traced payments from anonymous LLCs to the PR firms, then to the consulting firm that had fast-tracked the lab results, and finally to an account tied through a layer of intermediaries to a management consultant that Michael used for personal affairs. The financial paper trail, when it appeared, had the effect of a slow bulldozer. Money leaves fingerprints even when laundered through trusts. Transactions create constants. Auditors testified about ledger entries that had been rerouted. Emails that once looked unauthenticated now had headers showing IP addresses that placed their origin in businesses connected to Michael's associates. The scarfed consultant was subpoenaed and, under oath, proved to be a brittle thing. His story wavered under the pressure of documentation. He claimed independent work, but his travel logs, the auditors found, matched the hotel's service lift times. He had been in the company of a man whose phone pinged repeatedly in the hours the lab results were fast-tracked. Under the light of cross-examination, the scarfed man's confidence unraveled. He had been paid, he admitted finally, to expedite and to interpret.
He had signed off on papers he had not fully verified. That admission would later, in depositions and headlines, be described as an industry shortcut with consequences. Parallel to legal strategy, Lina's more public reclamation work began. She appeared, measured, composed, on a morning news program with Reed nearby, her hair pulled back but not militant. She spoke carefully, that she had never wanted spectacle, that she sought simply to know the truth, that she would accept whatever the law determined. Her humility, combined with a quiet insistence that she had rights, shifted the public mood from spectacle toward introspection. People are often sympathetic to someone who resists with dignity. Lina's refusal to beg or to sensationalize made her refusal all the more potent. At the same time, a small but crucial piece of proof surfaced that changed the landscape entirely. A notarized letter from Evelyn Kestrel's lawyer, found in a drawer in a quiet Swiss office, corroborated the handwritten note Lina had been given in the bakery. Evelyn's letter named Lina, though not with the name Lina that night, but with her formal legal name as a contingent heir under specified circumstances. And it contained legalese that, when read by lawyers, had the force of a lever. Evelyn had not simply given Lina a sentiment, she had prepared a legal path. The Swiss bank, having run their compliance checks, now had a duty. Their legal team, which had previously moved with the glacial patience of long privacy, now acted with a sudden professional urgency. The trust required a validation loop that would identify a trustee and verify a chain of succession.
Under the watchful eyes of an international law firm that could no longer be waved away, Kestrel Holding AG's dormant boards were notified. An heir had come forward, claims had been lodged, and local courts had issued a freeze until the matter was resolved. With access to the Swiss documents, Reed and Lina constructed the next part of their strategy, a public deposition schedule that would force Michael and his allies to answer under oath and produce documents. Depositions, to the uninitiated, are dry and tedious. To those who respect their destructiveness, they are a stage where falsehoods are revealed. Lies that survive idle gossip often crumbled under the sharp, methodical questioning of lawyers who never tire of asking the same questions in different ways. Depositions began, and with them came the exposure of more pragmatic things than the tabloids had imagined. Clandestine transfers from corporate accounts routed through consulting firms, invoices for emergency PR that carried memos referencing the hotel's banquet, and travel expenses that matched the scarfed man's appearances. The microphones of depositions are patient. Time reveals.
The most devastating moment for Michael came when an accounting clerk, a woman with a steady voice, testified that she had processed a wire transfer to a shell company 2 nights before the wedding. She had done so because her superior had told her to classify it as vendor services. She offered the ledger entries and the internal email that ordered the transfer. The email, once unearthed, had a subject line that read like a stage direction, "Protect narrative." Language, when examined, often betrays intent. That phrase, "protect narrative," became a hinge. It suggested orchestration rather than happenstance. It tied together the purchases of fast results, the payments to PR, and the arrangement of witnesses in a way that looked less like defensive action and more like a plan. Plans are proof. As the depositions aired, literally and figuratively, the board, forced by fiduciary duty and by the movement of shareholders, convened another emergency session. It was no longer merely about optics. Investors were demanding answers. Regulators were whispering. In a closed room where men had once felt secure in their untouchability, there was an argument about whether Michael's continued presence posed a systemic risk to the company's valuation. The motion to remove him was tabled again, and this time it passed with little fanfare. Michael's fall was legal and aesthetic. He lost formal control, the company distanced himself. The tabloids that had once played his face relished the new clip of a man being read a statement about his temporary relinquishment. The media is ferocious in its shifts. Heroes are quickly converted to cautionary tales. Victory, however, is rarely instantaneous. Sharon and Cade attempted a countermove. They produced a set of witnesses who claimed that Eveline Kestrel had been involved in business dealings that suggested she had multiple heirs. Complicated, tangled lines that would muddy the trust. These witnesses included a man who once served as a trustee and had a grudge. His testimony was embittered and specific, designed to create legal fog. He produced a scrap of paper that suggested Eveline had considered alternate beneficiaries. Reed, who anticipated the fog, had prepared for these micro-sabotages. He had hired a handwriting analyst who compared the signatures on Eveline's will to a variety of known samples: letters, donation receipts, a photograph bearing her curly script. The analyst testified to the letter's authenticity. The man who served as trustee had, under cross-examination, been forced to admit his motive: public embarrassment at a past disagreement with Eveline, and his chain of custody for the paper he produced was revealed to have missing links. In court, motives are sticky things. One by one, the opposing witnesses were unspooled. The scarfed consultant's payments were traced to a company that had reported the PR work as brand protection. Brand protection is a nicer way to say, rewrite the narrative.
The forensic lab manager, confronted with logs showing he had signed off before samples were delivered, admitted to shortcuts. Under oath, the truth is a fragile pirouette.
The day the court released a preliminary ruling recognizing Lina as a claimant to the Kestrel Trust, the city seemed to tilt. Headlines ran, and pundits who had previously speculated about stage drama now had to contend with legal documents. The Swiss bank placed Lina in the role of interim beneficiary with oversight from a neutral trustee. It was not the final triumph she had imagined when she had stood on the altar in shock, but it was the kind of practical, durable victory that matters. Lina's ascension to a seat of authority, even temporary, did not transform her overnight into a caricature of power. She had not sought the social theater of the old money. What she sought was to claim what had been promised and to use it carefully. Her first public move, announced without flair, was to suspend all discretionary transfers from the trust pending a full audit, and to mandate that Kestrel Holding AG's board be reconstituted with independent directors. It was a small, strategic step. It prevented the trust from being looted, and it forced a neutralization of the people who might otherwise move quickly to purge any inconvenient truth. When Lina convened her first formal meeting, no dais, no chandeliers, just a conference room with legal pads and a pitcher of water, there was a quiet about her that people found disconcerting. She spoke in lists and particulars, not in slogans. She closed accounts, demanded audits, and instructed the trustee to initiate investigations into any irregular transfers. Her choices were surgical. They were designed to deprive men like Michael of the instruments he had relied upon to buy reputation. Michael's reaction was fury glazed with calculation. He hired crisis lawyers and penned public statements accusing Lina of opportunism. He signed affidavits and argued in the court of public opinion that he had been the victim of a conspiracy. But the documents piled in his face were relentless. Wire transfers annotated with vendor services, emails asking for expedited verification, and a list of payments to consulting firms whose purpose could not be explained away as routine. Men who loved to think of themselves as architects of their own myth found themselves constrained by paper that refused to be theatrical. Publicly, supporters of Michael rallied around claims of betrayal. Friends who had his face on posters and press releases that called Lina an interloper. But privately, the ground had shifted. Institutional investors preferred the stability of neutral trustees to the unpredictability of scandal. Regulators tuned in. The company's stock dipped in the short term, and panic sells made nervous shareholders more inclined to rational action. Lina did not forget the bride.
Somewhere in the smoldering aftermath of tabloids and lawyers, Lina felt a strange sort of care for the woman whose life had been publicly ruptured. She watched the news footage of the bride, eyes hollow now, protected by lawyers, and felt no triumph in her pain. Power, Lina had come to understand, was not only about taking, but about choosing what to build with what had been taken. Her choices were underpinned by a moral architecture. To use Kestrel resources not as a means to revenge, but as instruments for restitution. She appointed a committee to review charitable commitments that Eveline Kestrel had supported and found that many community projects had been underfunded due to administrative diversion of funds. Lina directed that those mismatches be corrected. She established scholarships, funded clinics, and poured resources into the neighborhoods where people like the bakery woman had lived quiet, purposeful lives. Justice, she believed, should be operational. This practical redistribution of resources won her allies she had not expected. Local leaders, community organizations, and ordinary people who had once been invisible found in Kestrel funding a voice. Their gratitude was not theatrical. It was slow and durable in ways the tabloids could not monetize. Lina's power began to be measured not in the number of enemies she made, but in the depth of programs that could be funded for years. The public unmasking of Michael's cabal had a final, satisfying blow. In a deposition that would later be replayed across networks, a senior executive named John, who had once sat at Michael's side and benefited from his largesse, took the stand and, under careful questioning, admitted to signing off on transfers that had been classified as vendor services. He claimed he had done so because he trusted Michael and feared for his job. The admission was small and human, but it carried the weight of ethics. People had been willing to obfuscate because fear had been engineered into them. Out of the legal rubble, Michael's reputation collapsed into a different category. He was no longer feared in the same way. The games he had played were visible and older. Men like him thrive on mystique, and when mystique turns into documentation, the source of their power is revealed as performative. Michael found himself publicly removed from the company's operations, his allies evaporating into a pattern of self-preservation. Chiron and Cade, who had expected to be able to buy silence and spin, discovered that some invoices merely produce records, and that records are not easily dissolved. Lina's final move was a carefully staged exercise in corporate housekeeping. She petitioned the board to remove Michael from any position of influence that allowed him to be a decision-maker on matters related to Kestrel assets. The petition was backed by forensic reports, audit trails, and the testimony of several officers who had chosen to cooperate. The board, under legal obligation and under pressure from trustees and investors, agreed. The moment that Michael's name was struck from key documents and he was denied access to accounts he had once moved freely was anticlimactic in one sense and decisive in another. There was no dramatic arrest, no violent fall. There was a simple legal severing. It was the kind of justice that runs on paperwork and prudent decisions, messy, bureaucratic, and irreversible. After the dust settled, Lina stood in a small office with a view of the river, a room that smelled of lemon oil and old paper. She had the pendant thread between her fingers, no longer a prophecy, but a relic with meaning. She could have fashioned herself into something more theatrical, a ruler who would commandeer mythic power and enact theatrical revenge. Instead, she distributed authority, created oversight, and then resigned from positions that would let her exercise power arbitrarily. "Why not take it all?" Reed asked once, in a conversation that was half curiosity and half counsel. He had been with her through the audit trenches and had seen her map the moves of men who preferred to think they governed everything. Lina's answer was quiet. Because those who think power is hunger rarely notice when it eats the people who serve them. She set up a foundation in Eveline's name and named the bakery woman, a woman who had recognized lineage in a pendant, as a cultural advisor with a small stipend and a seat at the foundation's advisory table. For Lina, the point was not only to restore what had been promised, but to make sure the promise would have teeth, transparency, independent audits, and an insistence that money be used to create opportunities rather than to protect egos. The city watched the transformation with a mixture of bafflement and grudging respect. The tabloids found it harder to sell the narrative of the rags-to-riches takedown when the protagonist refused sensationalism. Instead, they had to settle for the slow, boring truth of cautious governance and the less exciting headline of funds redirected to community programs. Michael watched his old life narrow into the lane of history. His public persona, once a vehicle for influence, was now a cautionary tale for executives who mistook bravado for control. He had not been dismantled by violence or spectacle, but by procedure, the accumulation of small, precise decisions that made it unsustainable to remain in the positions he had once held. There was a peculiar kind of ruin in that, the erosion of power by the mundane application of law and accounting. At a private moment, Lina returned to the bakery. The woman who had given the pendant, Eveline's old friend perhaps, or a neighbor with a keen sense of timing, made Lina a cup of tea and did not ask for anything. "You kept it small," the woman said, wry and true. Good. Keep your hands clean. Lina laughed softly. I want them to be useful. The city, always eager for a final line, received a different ending than it had expected. The wedding that had once been a simple spectacle had become an instrument of accountability. A man who had left his bride at the altar to declare affection for another had found that the declaration could be reversed not by fists but by files. The mistress, once assumed to be a marginal figure, had been revealed to be a linchpin. She did not become what anyone had expected. She became an executor of a legacy and a steward of resources. News feeds quieted. Investors rebalanced. The bride faded from headlines into a quieter life, shielded by settlements and privacy agreements. Michael's name persisted in certain dinner conversations, a cautionary tale whispered at elongated tables. Lina continued to make deliveries early in the mornings for a while, by choice, to keep tethered to the people she served. She did not seek theatrics. Her satisfaction, when it came, was not the thunder of revenge, but the quiet of ledgers in order and a clinic with a functioning radiology wing. At an annual meeting of the community projects funded by the Kestrel Foundation, Lina spoke without dramatics. She spoke about accountability, the importance of giving power to local leaders, and the need to prevent the old machinery of influence from bending charity into a vehicle for self-aggrandizement. Her words were practical. Her actions had been decisive. The pendant lay in a small velvet box on the table, not as a symbol of conquest, but as a reminder of how easily appearances deceive. When she walked out into the sunlight that day, there were no fireworks. There was a street vendor selling coffee and a child who waved at her. The city continued to be a place of both small mercies and large injustices. Lina had not eradicated corruption. She had, for the moment, redirected a stream of resources and exposed the way men had used narrative as currency. And Michael, deposed, criticized, stripped of his formal authority, found himself staring at a world where the instruments he had used to command were now fenced. His empire, the one he had imagined was built on loyalty and fear, had been shown to be vulnerable to the patient work of law and the stubbornness of ledgers. In the end, the scene that had begun with a broken promise at an altar finished without the theater of blood. The fall was legal, reputational, and calculable. The mistress, the secret billionaire with the delivery gloves tucked into her handbag, had not avenged herself with cruelty. She had used the instruments that bind modern life: documents, audits, subpoenas, and the steady press of evidence. Her power, earned in the courtroom and exercised in boardrooms and clinics, was quietly consequential. Reed, watching from the sidelines as Lina stepped into her office at the foundation, allowed himself a rare smile. "You made them do it by the book," he said. "They wrote the book first," Lina replied.
They just forgot to sign in the right places. Outside, the city moved on. People fell in love, banks opened, and small shops did good work. The pendant lay against her chest that evening, warm and uncomplicated. It no longer had to be proof that she existed. It merely served as a reminder of what she had been given and what she intended to return. If anyone asked how she felt about the man who had left his bride for her, Lina's answer was practical. She had been hurt, publicly and sharply, but the remedy she sought was not to break him in vengeance. It was to make sure that systems which allowed men like him to manipulate truth could be checked. She wanted the corporate world to be less hospitable to theatrical cruelty and more accountable to the people who lived under its shadow. They say that power is a story people tell themselves. Lina chose to tell a different one where promises kept their weight, where signatures mattered more than spectacle, and where a small pendant could pivot the fate of many. It was not a fairy tale. It was a ledger reconciled and a trust administered so its benefits would outlast headlines.
If you want to see how the aftermath changes the city and whether those who profited from narrative find new ways to conceal, subscribe to follow the story. There are more ledgers to open and more promises to be kept.